Chapter 16, A Dragon in the North. There are many things that made Lyanna Stark shocked. In the 15 years she lived, a few had left lasting impressions. The death of her mother when she was still a child, the first time she stole Brandon's horse and fell trying to ride it across the frozen stream near Winterfell, the moment Prince Rhaegar Targaryen placed a crown of blue winter roses on her head at the tourney of Harrenhal, and more recently, the discovery that she was pregnant with Rhaegar's child. Then, of course, there was her near assault at the hands of wildlings. But what she saw now easily made it to her top 3 most shocking moments. A massive white dragon descended from the sky. It appeared from the pale clouds like a phantom, its wings slicing through the air in silence, only the roar of wind announcing its approach. The dragon landed before them, snow billowing around its gigantic claws as it touched the earth. It was enormous, larger than any warhorse, larger than a hall, with scales as white as snow, sleek and unblemished. Its wings folded with a graceful rustle, and its large, slitted eyes gleamed like polished ice. Lyanna gasped, stumbling a step backward. "What in the name of the old gods?" she whispered, instinctively pressing herself behind Harry. Harry stood calmly, as if he hadn't just been met by one of the most fearsome beasts known to man. He looked at the dragon with quiet fondness, no fear in his posture. "Lyanna," he said, turning slightly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is my dragon. His name is Winter." Lyanna blinked. "You have a dragon?" Harry smiled. "Yes, he's been following us forever. Quietly. He always keeps an eye on me." Winter exhaled through his nostrils, and the warm steam from his breath wafted into the freezing air. Lyanna felt like her knees might buckle. The stories of dragons were just that, stories. Tales sung by bards and whispered by old crones around hearths. Everyone knew the dragons had died out with the last Targaryens during the Dance of the Dragons. And yet here stood a living legend. The dragon lowered its head slightly, its piercing gaze fixed on her. Harry nudged her gently forward. "Winter wants to meet you." "Meet me?" she hissed. "It's a dragon." "He's more than that," Harry said. "He's intelligent. He understands us." Winter shifted again, flicking some of the snow from his wings as he adjusted his position. The dragon stared at Lyanna, tilting its massive head as if waiting for her to do something. Lyanna took a shaky step forward. Hi, Winter," she said awkwardly, raising a hand in the air. Then she added, in a whisper, "Don't eat me." Harry laughed behind her. "He won't. He will protect you." Winter gave a slow, deliberate nod, and the sight made Lyanna freeze in place. "He understood you?" she said in disbelief. Harry nodded. "Of course, dragons are connected to their rider. But Winter, he's more than just a beast. He's seen worlds beyond this one. He understands fear, anger, even sorrow." Lyanna turned to look at him. "Where did you get him?" Harry hesitated. "That's a long story, one for another time." They stood in silence for a few moments, the snow falling gently around them, and Winter's breath steaming in the cold air. Then, Harry asked, "Would you like to fly with him?" Lyanna's mouth dropped open. "What?" "He can carry us both. He won't drop you, I promise." She looked at Winter, then back at Harry. "Is he safe?" "He's the safest place you could be." Winter lowered his massive body to the ground, wings splayed slightly for balance. A low, rumbling sound emerged from his chest. Not a growl, but something softer. Harry climbed up first, expertly gripping the dragon's spine ridges. He held a hand down to her. Lyanna hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. The moment she settled behind him, Winter lifted into the air. The earth fell away beneath them as the wind rushed past, and Lyanna clutched Harry tightly. The sensation of flight, true flight, was like nothing she had ever known. The cold air slapped her cheeks. The snowflakes stung her eyes, but the feeling of freedom was overwhelming. They flew high above the nearby glacier lake, over forests, mountains, and frozen rivers. From this height, Lyanna could see the world stretched out below her like a map. She let out a laugh wild and free, and Harry, seated in front of her, smiled. When Winter landed again, it was in a clearing near the edge of a glacier, far beyond the reach of any wildling settlement. The air was sharp, the silence profound. Lyanna stumbled slightly as she dismounted, her legs weak from the thrill of flight. "You're insane," she said breathlessly. "Do you know that?" Harry grinned. "You liked it." She did, but she wasn't about to admit it. Winter moved behind them, curling into a resting position, wings tucked close. Lyanna looked at Harry, still trying to piece everything together. "Who are you really?" she asked. Harry looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing the pale blue of the northern morning. "A boy who grew up in a cupboard," he said softly. "A boy who lived. A man now trying to live on his own terms." She furrowed her brow. "A cupboard," he chuckled. "Another story for another time." They made camp there, with Harry conjuring a small magical shelter. Nothing that would arouse suspicion, just a windbreak and heat charms for their blankets. Lyanna sat beside him, the silence between them no longer awkward. "I'm not sure where we go from here," she admitted. Harry looked toward the north. "Further, until we find a place where no one can find us." "And what then?" He turned to her, his voice steady. "Then we build something new." And far above, circling silently like a guardian in the sky, the white dragon Winter watched them, unseen by any soul save his bonded. The morning air was biting cold, crisp with the scent of pine and the faint tang of frost. Lyanna Stark had begun to grow used to waking among snow-laden boughs and canvas covers, but what greeted her that morning made her sit up with such suddenness that the blanket slid off her shoulders. There, not far from their makeshift camp, stood the dragon. Winter, massive, pristine, wild. The dragon's white scales shimmered like fresh snow in the rising sunlight. Its long wings folded gently to its sides as it crouched over its meal, a recently slain mammoth. Its tusks were broken, its thick woolen hide ripped open, and steam rose from the open carcass as Winter tore into it with deliberate satisfaction, like a cat that had just found a fat mouse. Lyanna swallowed hard. "By the old gods," she whispered. "He caught a mammoth?" "Yes," Harry said cheerfully from beside her, already crouching down to light a small magical fire near the canvas lean-to they'd raised the night before. "He bring down one last week. They're surprisingly fast for their size. Took me a while to believe the mammoth exist here." "Yes, mammoths are near extinct in the West Rose," Lyanna said, incredulous. "Only ever read about them in old Maester Willen's scrolls." "There's some mammoth beyond the wall," Harry said, standing again and brushing the snow from his cloak. "Still an easy hunt. He's been practicing." She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I feel like I'm living in a fever dream." Harry smiled and reached into his cloak pocket, pulling out what looked like a tiny wooden box. "What's that?" she asked, watching him curiously. Instead of replying, Harry tapped the box with his wand and muttered, "Ingorgo." Before her eyes, the box expanded into a large, intricately carved trunk, the kind that looked like it belonged in a nobleman's solar. Lyanna stepped closer, astonished. "Is that a trunk?" "Indeed," Harry said with a grin, kneeling before it. He flipped open the lid and began to rummage inside. Out came bundles of dried vegetables wrapped in enchanted linen, spice jars with labels in a flowing script she didn't recognize, polished cooking pots that gleamed like silver, and thick slabs of cured meat still glistening with salt. "Where did you get all this?" Harry shrugged, setting a pot over the fire. "Collected them, bought them, traded for some in White Harbor. Others I brought from, well, far away." "You're rich," she said, watching him with narrowed eyes. "You're more than a wandering swordsman, aren't you?" "I never claimed to be just a swordsman," he replied with a wink. "But then how do you know cooking? Didn't you had servants?" He tossed a handful of chopped onion into the pot, and a warm, savory smell immediately began to rise. "Because I like it. Food is one of the few ways to bring comfort in a wild place." When she tasted the stew he prepared, thick with meat, vegetables, and spices that danced on her tongue, Lyanna couldn't help but groan in delight. "Gods, this is better than anything I've had at Winterfell." "High praise from the daughter of a warden of the North," Harry said, offering her a slice of crusty bread he had baked over the coals the night before. She nodded, licking her fingers. "Better than the royal kitchens, I'd wager." Their moment of calm was interrupted by memory. Lyanna looked toward the woods, toward where the Ice Raven tribe had once stood. "They told us to stay," she murmured. "Said the rest of the free folk wouldn't be so kind." "I remember," Harry replied, stirring the pot. "But kindness doesn't build a future. I want to offer something else." "And what is that?" she asked. "A home," he said simply. "A place where wildlings or free folk can live without fear, where they can work, grow, trade. A real settlement, with walls, with order." Lyanna studied him as he stood and poured her a bowl. Do you really believe that's possible? Harry handed her the bowl and crouched beside her, gazing out into the white wilderness. I have a dragon. I have gold. I have magic. And I have you. That made her cheeks color, and she looked away. But more than that, Harry continued, I have a dream. If we settle near the eastern edge of this land, we can build a port. Not for the 7 kingdoms, they'll never trade with the wildlings, but for Essos. The free cities don't care where the goods come from if the gold is real. Lyanna frowned. You'd risk your life for that? I already have. Later that day, they took flight on Winter's back, soaring high above the frozen forests and ice-covered valleys. The land below was white and ancient, dotted with craggy cliffs, dark lakes, and the occasional herd of elk fleeing at the dragon's shadow. For 3 days they flew, stopping only to sleep in shallow caves or among thick evergreens. Harry used his magical compass to orient himself while Lyanna kept watch with sharp northern eyes. Then, at last, Harry saw it. The river. It was a grand and ancient artery of water, winding through the snowfields like a silver snake. The river forked sharply into 2 distinct branches, creating a natural wedge of land protected on 3 sides. The perfect spot. There, he said, pointing. That's where we'll build. Lyanna squinted. That's the Antler River. I read about it once. Only a few ever dared live near it. Floods, harsh winters, and legends. Harry grinned. I like legends. As winter descended toward a wide, flat section of the land between the forks, Harry looked thoughtful. What should we call it? You're asking me? She said, stunned. He nodded. It's our home now. Our dream. She thought for a moment. Something northern. Something that speaks of survival. I was thinking. Harry hesitated, then smiled. Narnia. She blinked. Narnia. A place from a story I read as a child. A land of magic, snow, talking animals, and endless wonder. A place where even the most unlikely people can become kings and queens. Lyanna let the name roll off her tongue. Narnia. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled, genuinely, freely, with hope. Narnia, she repeated. Then let's build it. Harry nodded, placing a hand over hers. Together, and high above them, winter roared. A cry that echoed across the vast white wilderness, as if the dragon himself was claiming the land, their future, their Narnia. Chapter 17. Magic in the Walls. Lyanna Stark awoke to warmth. It was the first sensation she registered, true, enveloping warmth that wrapped around her like a mother's embrace. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back at Winterfell in her old bedchamber, curled beneath heavy woolen quilts, the fire crackling in the hearth nearby, and her maid gently calling her to wake. But the silence was too deep, too pure, and the scent was not of burning pine logs or beeswax candles, but of fresh wood, melted snow, and something faintly herbal. She opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling above her was smooth and dark, made of polished wood planks that gleamed faintly in the morning light. A soft ray of sunshine poured through the square-paned window to her right, illuminating a corner of the room where a stack of books sat neatly on a carved shelf. The air inside was warm and still, and her breath did not fog before her. For the first time since leaving Winterfell, she had slept without cold biting at her toes or fear clenching her stomach. She pushed the blanket aside, thick, quilted, and impossibly soft, and swung her legs out of the bed, bare feet touching a rug laid over wooden floorboards. Her cloak had been hung near the fireplace, which now glowed with soft embers. She realized she was still in her shift from the night before, her braid loose against her shoulder. Then it all came rushing back. The flight with winter, the snowy expanse of the land beyond the wall, the Antler River, and Harry. She stood and walked to the doorway, rubbing her eyes. The cabin was not large, but it was beautifully crafted. 2 beds sat on either side of the room, each neatly made. Between them, a small wooden table stood with 2 chairs tucked beneath it. Pots and pans hung above a counter where a basin rested, beside a small cabinet that held simple dishes. Near the hearth, a kettle steamed gently, and the scent of something savory reached her nose. Morning, came a voice from the far side of the room. She turned. Harry was crouched near a small wood-burning stove, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon. He was dressed in a dark green tunic and warm trousers, his cloak draped over the chair beside him. His hair was tousled from the wind and sleep, but his expression was content. Lyanna blinked. Where, how? He grinned. You like it. She turned around slowly, still in awe. You made this with magic? Mostly, he said, standing and ladling something from the pot into 2 bowls. I used a lot of transfiguration and conjuration. It lasts for about 2 weeks before the structure begins to fade. But it's stable, safe, and more importantly, warm. You made this last night when I was sleeping. With the help of magic, yes. Still had to gather wood and snowproof the corners. And I enchanted the hearth so it keeps the temperature stable inside. Lyanna walked to the table and sat, still staring around. It's like something out of a dream. He handed her a bowl. Try this. Stew with beans, wild carrots, and salted pork. She accepted it gratefully and took a bite. Her eyes widened at the flavor. If I had met you before all this mess, I would have begged Father to make you my personal cook. I'd rather not, he said with a laugh. Too many rules. Besides, I don't cook for money. I cook for myself. She looked down at the bowl, then back around the room. You even made beds. Real beds. I don't remember the last time I slept so well. You were drooling slightly, Harry teased, sipping from his own bowl. She shot him a glare. I was not. You were. She rolled her eyes, though a smile tugged at her lips. You're impossible. And you're difficult. But we seem to manage. They ate in silence for a time, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. The peace was welcome, the kind that rarely existed in her old life. Before secret meetings, fleeing her home, and being nearly assaulted in the wilderness. When the bowls were empty, Lyanna placed hers on the counter and turned toward him again. You said this house won't last long. Harry nodded, leaning back against the chair. A week, maybe 2. That's the limit for most conjured structures. The magic begins to unravel after that. And after that, I'll build a real cottage. Stone, timber, insulation. Maybe even some glass windows if I can melt the sand nearby and transfigure it. It'll take longer, but I want something that lasts. For us, and for the people who'll come after. She crossed her arms and looked at him curiously. You think there will be others? There always are, Harry said. Wanderers, lost ones, families seeking shelter, people who don't fit in with the clans. If we build something strong here, a real settlement, others will find their way to it. And we'll call it Narnia, she said softly. He smiled again. Yes, a land of snow, wonder, and prosperity. Lyanna walked to the window, brushing the frost away with her sleeve. Outside, the dragon lay curled near a ridge, snow already beginning to dust its pale scales again. Winter lifted his head slowly, glancing toward the cabin as if he could sense her gaze. She quickly stepped back. He still terrifies me. He's more bark than bite, Harry said. Unless you're a mammoth. She turned toward him, voice quieter now. And me? Why do you keep protecting me? You don't even know me. Harry stood. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe I just know you're someone worth protecting. She looked away, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. I'm not the girl from the songs, Harry. I'm not a princess locked in a tower. I'm the girl who ran away. The girl carrying a bastard. Then you're brave, he said simply. Silence settled again. She finally looked up. What if we do build this place? What if it becomes real, permanent? Will you stay? Yes, Harry said, without hesitation. This isn't just a hiding place, Lyanna. It's a beginning. And somehow Lyanna believed him. Lyanna Stark had never seen a man levitate a boulder before, let alone 5. Yet every day since Harry had begun working on their future cottage, she had watched, often from the comfort of her conjured chair near the cabin, as he waved his hand or wand and summoned massive stones from the forest's edge or riverbank, guiding them through the air like they weighed no more than feathers. They would float and hover in the air with a hum, and with a flick of his fingers, the boulders would gently settle into place with precision and grace that no mason could replicate. It was mesmerizing. More so was the man himself. Harry was shirtless that day, his tunic discarded in favor of cooling off from the work. His back glistened with sweat beneath the pale sunlight, muscles shifting with each movement as he walked across the rising stone foundation. He wiped his brow with a rag and then raised his hand again, guiding a fresh tree trunk, recently felled and stripped of its bark, into position. Lyanna tried not to stare. She failed miserably. It must be the pregnancy, she told herself. That's what it was. Hormones. Wild, unpredictable, treacherous hormones. But it didn't help that Harry was so calm, so capable, so unlike the men she had grown up around. She had known lords and knights her whole life, Men full of bravado and sharp tongues, adorned in fine silks or heavy armor. Men like Robert, whose affections came in the form of bold declarations and loud laughter. But Harry, he wasn't loud. He didn't boast. He built. He planned. He cooked. God's help her. Better than any castle chef she'd ever known. And he listened. Truly listened when she spoke. And when he sparred with his enchanted dummies, armored log men that moved, swung, and even insulted him in crude, magically infused voices, she found herself laughing out loud. Swing like that again, and you'll drop your own blade, you half-witted goat. One dummy had bellowed just that morning. Harry rolled his eyes and jabbed it through the belly with a clean strike. Better? He asked. Marginally. Still wouldn't scare a crippled badger, the dummy replied. Lyanna had nearly choked on her breakfast. Now, she stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed over her chest, one foot resting on a moss-covered stone, as she watched Harry shift a pile of stones into a neat row. She bit her lip, cheeks flushing when he turned slightly and caught her watching. You're staring again, he said with a teasing grin. I'm not, she lied. I was just watching your technique. Very graceful. Oh, interested in learning. Lyanna looked down at her swollen belly. She was just beginning to show, barely, but her gown had grown snug. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a bit preoccupied. Harry chuckled, lowering himself to sit on one of the partially built walls. True, but when the baby comes, and you feel ready, I'll teach you. Sword, bow, knife, whatever you want. She looked up, surprised. Really? You'd teach me to fight? His gaze softened. Of course. I think every person should know how to defend themselves, especially in a world like this. No one's ever offered, she said quietly. Not even my brothers. Father always said I should learn music and dancing, not the blade. Well, Harry said, pulling on his boots and standing again. Then your father's a stubborn old man. She smiled faintly, eyes shimmering. He is. They fell into silence again, save for the crackle of magic and the occasional thump of a rock settling into place. Lyanna eventually approached him, watching closely as he flicked his wrist and a small gust of wind brushed dust from a newly set joint in the wall. I thought you said using magic for construction was a bad idea, she said, folding her arms. It is, he replied without missing a beat. If you're trying to conjure the materials, magically created things don't last long. But these stones, these trees, they're real. I'm just using magic to move them, not change them. So the cottage won't fall apart? Not unless you plan on hurling mammoths at it. She snorted. I'll try to restrain myself. Harry smiled at her warmly, then turned back to the work. I'm insulating the walls with clay. Helps trap heat. Once the walls are finished, I'll enchant the roof to be waterproof until I can finish the shingles. She reached out and ran her hand along the newly stacked stones. They were smooth, well-fitted, mortared with natural earth that smelled clean and cool. You've built all this in just 3 days. Well, I had help, he said, glancing at the enchanted tools that hovered nearby, brushing off excess debris or smoothing edges. And what happens when this place is finished? She asked, softer now. Will you keep building? Harry paused, turning toward her with a more serious expression. Yes, one home is a start, but if we want a real settlement, a place people can live, raise children, farm, trade, then we need more. Houses, a forge, storage huts, maybe even a school. She looked at him with a strange expression. You've thought this through. I've had a lot of time to think, he said simply. And people deserve a life with dignity, not one spent hiding in caves or scavenging off the dead. She hesitated. And me? Harry turned to her fully. What about you? Where do I fit in all this? His eyes searched hers. Wherever you want to. I won't cage you, Lyanna. You're not here because I saved you or because of the child. You're here because you chose to be. She swallowed thickly, a rush of heat and emotion rising in her chest. She nodded and turned away quickly, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. Behind her, Harry went back to work, and she watched him again, this time with something deeper than just admiration. She was no longer just a runaway lady. She was a woman standing at the beginning of something new, a foundation being laid, not just of stone, but of trust, of purpose, and maybe, just maybe, of love. Chapter 18. Building Together. When Lyanna Stark first set foot inside the finished cottage, she stopped dead in the doorway. Gods, she whispered. unable to help herself. It was not a simple cabin, not really. The walls were thick and solid, built from carefully fitted stones that still held the earthy scent of riverbanks. The high wooden beams overhead met in a sturdy peak. The roof lined with thatch Harry had layered in precise, overlapping rows. Light poured through the front windows, actual glass panes not made out of wood, making the place glow golden in the afternoon sun. She turned slowly in the entryway, taking it all in. The wide main room had a great fireplace in the center, its hearth framed by smooth river stones. A broad wooden table stood nearby, with mismatched chairs that Harry had carved himself. Every piece was slightly uneven, the surfaces imperfect, but to Lyanna they felt more genuine than any polished furniture she had known in Winterfell's halls. Off the main room were several other chambers, 2 bedchambers, a storeroom already lined with sacks of flour, salt, smoked meat and dried vegetables, and a smaller room that Harry explained would one day serve as a study. There was even a trapdoor leading down into a cool, dark cellar lined with stone shelves. She climbed back up, brushing dust off her skirts, and met Harry standing in the doorway, arms folded, watching her reaction. "You built all this?" she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the vast, echoing space. He shrugged, though a faint flush colored his cheekbones. "You're a noble woman. I thought it wouldn't do to have you living in a glorified shed." Lyanna shook her head slowly. "This isn't a cottage, Harry. It's a hall, a proper house." "It'll do," he said almost shyly. She turned to face him fully, searching his eyes. "And you built it with your own hands." "Mostly," he admitted. "Magic helped." He said it like it was nothing, like he hadn't labored day after day, hauling stones and timber, shaping every beam, laying every brick, until his hands were raw and his voice hoarse from explaining what he was doing. Lyanna felt her throat tighten. "You didn't have to do all this?" she said, softer still. "I did," he answered simply. "I wanted a place you'd feel safe." Her gaze dropped to her hands, which she twisted in the fabric of her skirt. No one, not her father, not Brandon, not Rieger, had ever worked so tirelessly for her comfort, for her dignity. And this man, this stranger from a world she couldn't fully comprehend, had built her a home. When she looked up again, Harry was watching her carefully, as though worried he had overstepped. She swallowed hard, summoning a shaky smile. "I suppose I'll have to learn how to keep it clean, then," she said, trying to sound light. He chuckled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "That part one can help with, though I was hoping you'd do less work than more. You should rest." "I've done quite enough resting," she said firmly. "I can't just sit here watching you build everything." "You're with child, Lyanna. You don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "Maybe I can't haul stones or cut timber, but I can learn to cook and I can tend the hearth. You can't be expected to build a settlement and feed us both single-handedly." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll do it together." The next morning, Lyanna woke to the sound of hammering outside. She dressed quickly and stepped into the cold dawn, wrapping a fur cloak around her shoulders. Winter lay curled nearby, his white body blending so perfectly with the snowy slope that she nearly missed him. He cracked open one eye as she passed, then settled back to sleep. Harry was already at work, standing beside a circular stone foundation that had appeared overnight. He straightened when he saw her approach. "You're up early," he said. "I could say the same," she replied, eyeing the half-finished walls. "You finished the house yesterday. What is this?" He wiped sweat from his brow. "A smokehouse. We'll need to preserve meat if we're going to stay through the next winter. Once the rivers thaw, we'll have fish to dry, too." "You never stop," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Someone has to keep busy. And what would you have me do while you build another house?" "Whatever you like." She hesitated. "I'd like to help." He tilted his head, studying her. "You mean that?" "I do," she said. "I may not know how to build anything, but I can learn to cook. I can keep the hearth. I can—" She looked away, voice lower. "I can be useful." "You're already useful," he said gently. "But if you want to learn, I'd be glad to teach you." That day, Harry taught her to start a fire from nothing but flint and steel. She nearly took her own eyebrows off 3 times before she managed a proper spark. "Don't laugh," she scolded as he covered his grin with one hand. "I wouldn't dream of it," he said solemnly, though his eyes were bright with amusement. He showed her how to gut and clean a rabbit, how to slice vegetables without losing the tip of her finger, and how to boil water without scorching the bottom of the pot. Lyanna listened carefully, determined not to embarrass herself further. In the evenings, she practiced kneading dough and spicing stews while Harry worked outside. She heard the rhythmic thunk of his axe and the creak of ropes as he raised beams into place. When she peeked out the window, she saw him laboring by lamplight, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair damp with snow and sweat. Something warm and unsettling curled in her belly. The nights were growing longer, the air sharper, but the house remained warm. And slowly, so slowly she hardly noticed, the hollow ache of her running, her shame, her fear, began to ease. One evening, as she sat beside the hearth stirring a pot, Harry came in, dusting snow from his shoulders. "Smells wonderful," he said, leaning over to sniff the steam rising from her stew. "Don't flatter me," she said dryly. "I've only just learned not to burn everything." He chuckled and sat across from her. For a while, neither spoke. The fire cracked, casting golden light over the stone walls. She glanced up and found him watching her with that steady, quiet gaze. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said softly. "Just glad you're here." And despite everything, her lost home, her uncertain future, Lyanna realized she was glad, too. Here, in this improbable house, they were building something neither of them had ever had. A place that belonged to them alone. The morning had dawned pale and cold, thin sunlight glittering across the hard-packed snow. Harry had been up before dawn, dressing in warm furs and carefully fastening the scabbard of his sword across his back. Lyanna, still sleep-heavy, watched him from the edge of her blanket as he packed his satchel with dried meat, a flask of water, and a small, battered leather book. When he turned to her, his face was serious. "I'll be gone most of the day," he said. "Perhaps longer." Lyanna's heart gave a strange little lurch. "Where are you going?" He hesitated, just long enough to make her stomach twist. "North," he said at last. "I have things I need to find." "What things?" she pressed. "Books," he admitted. "And information. There are ruins, old places where magic once thrived. I need to understand this land if we're to survive here." "You're going alone?" she asked, unable to hide the note of worry in her voice. He smiled faintly and reached to brush a stray curl from her cheek. "I won't be alone. Winter will be with me." Her throat tightened. "When will you come back?" "Before nightfall if I can." He paused, studying her face. "Lyanna, stay here. Or if you must go out, don't stray far from the house." "Why?" "Because until I know what's in those hills, I don't trust what might be watching." His gaze sharpened. "Promise me." She nodded, though unease coiled in her belly. "I promise." Satisfied, Harry turned and stepped out into the cold. A moment later, she heard the heavy rush of wings as winter launched into the sky. When she finally gathered her courage to look out the window, she saw the dragons soaring north, Harry a small figure on his back. She didn't see them again for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, Lyanna had exhausted every chore she knew how to do. She'd cleaned the kitchen twice, swept the hearth, and sorted the small piles of vegetables and dried grains Harry had brought from White Harbor. When she tried to read, she found herself glancing up every few lines to peer out the window, as though Harry might appear any moment. Her thoughts grew darker as the hours passed. What if he'd left her? What if he'd grown tired of her helplessness, her belly swelling with another man's child? What if he'd flown off to find some associate beauty with clever eyes and no burdens? She pressed her palm against her stomach and closed her eyes, shame prickling hot in her throat. "You fool. You hardly know him. You have no claim on him." But knowing it didn't stop the ache. After she forced herself to eat a little bread and broth, she decided she couldn't sit idle any longer. She wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders, stepped outside, and began to walk along the edge of the river that bordered the western side of the property. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, but it felt good steadying. She followed the river's curve for a while, boots crunching over crusted snow. When she finally looked up, she froze. Across the stream, less than 50 yards away, a hunting party moved among the trees. 18 men, wildlings. She counted them automatically, her heart thudding in her chest. They carried long spears and crude bows, and in their midst, they hauled a massive elk tied to a sled. Several of them were laughing, voices carrying across the quiet river. She stumbled back a step, breath caught in her throat. If they saw her, but none of them looked her way. In fact, when one tall man glanced directly at her, his gaze slid across the trees behind her as though she were invisible. His eyes didn't even flicker. Lyanna's pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see some cover she'd failed to notice. A bush or a tree. But there was nothing. She stood in plain view. And yet, they saw nothing. They moved on, dragging their prize, their voices fading into the snow-laden pines. She waited until the last of them disappeared before she turned and fled back toward the cottage, her heart hammering. It was well past nightfall when she heard the low rush of wings again. She rushed to the door, pulling it open just as winter descended like a falling star. The dragon landed without a sound, and Harry slid down from his back, his cloak heavy with frost. He looked tired, but when he saw her in the doorway, relief softened his expression. "I'm back," he said simply. She didn't answer. She only stepped aside to let him in, shutting the door behind him before her voice broke free. "You were gone all day," she said, her words sharper than she meant them to be. "You said you'd return before nightfall." "I know." He set his satchel down and rubbed his gloved hands together over the fire. "I found what I was looking for, but it took longer than I planned." "You didn't tell me where you were going," she whispered. He looked up at her, surprise flickering in his gaze. I didn't think that I'd worry," she said, her voice rising despite herself. "That I'd sit here wondering if you were dead or if you decided you were done with me?" Something in her chest cracked, and she swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I'm sorry," Harry said quietly. "I never meant to make you feel abandoned." She hugged her arms around herself. "I saw wildlings, 18 of them, on the riverbank. They looked straight at the cottage, and they didn't see it." "Why?" He took a slow breath. "Because I put a ward around this place. An enchantment that bends perception. Anyone who doesn't know it's here will look right past it." She blinked. "A ward?" He nodded. "Until I'm ready, until we have walls, defenses, and allies, I won't risk being found." "It's not cowardice," he added firmly. "It's caution." Her anger faded, replaced by something rawer, relief, perhaps, or something closer to gratitude. I thought you'd left," she whispered. Harry stepped forward and reached for her hand. His fingers were cold, but she didn't pull away. "I won't leave you," he said. "Not unless you ask me to." Her throat tightened, and she looked away before her tears could spill. Later, after he had warmed himself and they'd shared a quiet meal, Harry set a sheaf of parchment and a quill on the table. "I have a favor to ask," he said. Lyanna raised a brow. "A favor?" He nodded. "I want you to teach me." "To teach you what?" "To read and write." He hesitated. "In Westerosi script." Her eyes widened. "You can't read it?" "Not fluently. I can speak your tongue, but your letters, they're different. The shapes, the marks. I know some, but not enough to read a ledger or write a proper letter." Lyanna felt a smile tug at her mouth despite everything. "You're a man who can conjure a house from nothing, and you can't read the local alphabet?" He looked sheepish. "Not yet." She laughed softly, the tension easing from her shoulders. "All right, Harry Potter. Sit down. We'll start with the basics." And as she guided his hand over the parchment, showing him how to form the shape of an A, or rather, an ash rune as the Northmen called it, she realized she no longer felt like a guest in his house. She felt like a part of something. A teacher. Partner. Chapter 19. Potter Castle in winter. The days settled into a quiet rhythm neither of them had ever known before. Most mornings began the same way. The golden light of dawn slipping through the small glass panes of their cottage, the warmth of the hearth, and the comforting smell of fresh bread Harry had baked the night before. When Lyanna stirred, she often found Harry already at the heavy wooden table, brow furrowed in concentration as he traced letters onto parchment with painstaking care. "Ash," she said, leaning over his shoulder one morning. "Not an S. Like this." She took his hand gently and guided it, reshaping the crooked rune. He sighed. "You'd think learning another alphabet would be easier after everything else I've learned." "You'd think?" she teased, brushing her hair behind her ear. "But you have the handwriting of a drunk chicken." His mouth twitched. "You wound me." Lyanna hid her smile and settled in the chair beside him. From the beginning again. When the weather was clear and the sun hung high over the snow-laden trees, they took breaks from lessons. Harry would head out to build. The single cottage had become just the beginning. First, there had been the smokehouse, a squat round building lined inside with hooks for drying fish and curing meat. Then came a shed for storing tools, a small granary for the sacks of grain Harry had traded in White Harbor, and finally, something Lyanna could only describe as a miniature fortress. It had a thick wooden outer wall, high enough to deter any prowling beasts, and for sturdy corner posts reinforced with stone. There was no gate yet, just a simple rope to lift and lower a plank across the entrance. When she asked Harry why he was making it so strong, he simply said, "Because someday, others may come, and they'll need protection." And when she pressed her palm to the wall, she thought, "It already feels like a place meant to last." One afternoon, as she stood in the little stockyard they'd fenced in behind the smokehouse, she found herself laughing aloud. 3 sheep had escaped through the gap Harry had forgotten to mend, and now they were trotting merrily around the clearing, their little hooves kicking up puffs of snow. "Harry!" she called, nearly breathless. "They're out again." From behind the new granary, Harry poked his head around the corner. His hair was windblown, and he had a smear of clay on his cheek. "Damn it!" he muttered, setting aside his hammer. "I thought I fixed that gap." He jogged over, grabbing a small lamb as it tried to slip past him. It bleated in protest. Lyanna caught another one and cradled it in her arms. Her cheeks flushed from cold and laughter. "This is your fault," she said accusingly. "My fault. You said you knew how to build a fence." "I built a fence," he said, deadpan. "I didn't say it was a good fence." She snorted and pressed her face into the lamb's wool to hide her grin. After they corralled the flock back inside, Lyanna sat down on the small milking stool and sighed. One of the ewes ambled over and nudged her shoulder. She scratched its ears absently, feeling a little glow of contentment. "I never thought I'd end up here," she murmured. Harry glanced over, wiping his hands on a rag. "Do you regret it?" She looked up at him, at the wind-chapped cheeks, the honest curiosity in his eyes. "No," she said honestly. "I don't." The evenings belonged to their books. Harry had amassed a small library in White Harbor, and now the shelves in the main room were lined with leather spines. Treatises on Westerosi history, tattered volumes of Valyrian poetry, ledgers from merchant captains, even an herbal compendium. And in those quiet hours, Lyanna would sit beside him, one hand resting protectively over her growing belly, and help him sound out the looping letters of Valyrian. "Vezov Gene Azantes," she recited one night, tapping the line with her finger. Harry frowned. "Vezov Gene Azantes. What does that mean?" "He is an honorable knight," he snorted. "Doubt anyone would call me that." "You saved me from wildlings," she reminded him. "That counts for something." He glanced at her, something unspoken in his expression. "You saved yourself, Lyanna. I only helped." Harry's fishing expeditions became another part of their routine. One morning, when she followed him down to the river, she watched in astonishment as he cast a simple handline into the water, then waited patiently until he felt the tug. "You've done this before," she said skeptically. "Never," he admitted cheerfully. "But I figured the fish here have never met a proper fisherman either, so it balances out." She threw her head back and laughed, startling a pair of crows from the trees. But by midday he had filled 2 baskets with fat silverfish. That night, she cleaned them while he salted and packed the rest for smoking. When she finally tasted the fresh roasted fillet with a sprinkle of salt and lemon, she thought no banquet in any lord's hall could compare. Soon the little settlement had taken on a rhythm as natural as breathing. There was always something to do. Fish to clean, firewood to stack, walls to mend. And for the first time in her life, Lyanna found herself proud of her small accomplishments. Learning how to milk a ewe without spilling half of it on her skirts, or baking a loaf of bread that didn't end up as hard as a stone. In the quiet of evening, she sometimes sat on the threshold of the main hall. Harry insisted on calling it Potter Castle, and looked out at the snowy wilderness. Winter would be curled at the edge of the clearing, his massive body blending with the drifts. And beside her, Harry would be scribbling letters, lips moving as he practiced Westerosi script under her watchful eye. "Ash," she corrected gently. He grimaced. "Again, again," she insisted. He sighed, but there was a smile hidden in it. Here, in this impossible place, far from her family, her old life, and all the expectations that had bound her, Lyanna was learning what it meant to start over, and she was no longer afraid of it. Snow fell in whispering drifts outside Potter Castle, the flakes gathering on the eaves and window ledges until the world beyond looked as though it had been wrapped in soft white cloth. The wind keened over the Antler River, but inside, the fire roared warm and bright. Lyanna sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, absently darning a tear in one of Harry's woolen cloaks. She wasn't very skilled at mending. More often than not, her stitches looked like a drunken spider's web, but it felt good to have something to do with her hands. Harry was across the room at the long table, poring over an old leather-bound book with yellowed pages so thin they looked ready to crumble. His brows were drawn in concentration, a lock of dark hair falling over his forehead. From time to time, his lips moved as he silently sounded out a word. She watched him for a while, feeling the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. Watching him had become a quiet habit, one she tried not to think too hard about. After a long silence, she set the mending aside. "Harry," she said softly. He looked up, blinking as though waking from a trance. "Yes. Will you tell me?" she asked. "About you." He frowned faintly. "I told you. I'm from the east. Across the narrow sea." "You're lying." His eyes met hers, startled. "You're kind," she went on, voice quiet but certain. "But you're not a very good liar." He sighed and rubbed his thumb along the book's spine. "Lyanna, I've told you everything," she said, her voice tightening. "About Rieger, about my brothers, about what I've done and what I've lost. You know all my secrets, and I don't even know who you are." The words hung between them, raw and honest. For a long moment, Harry didn't move. Then he closed the book and set it aside. He drew in a slow breath, like a man gathering courage. "All right," he said at last. "I'll tell you." Lyanna swallowed and waited, heart beating fast. Harry shifted in his chair, folding his hands on the table. He looked at the fire, not at her. "I'm not from Essos," he began. "I'm not from any land you've heard of. I come from somewhere else entirely, a different world." She stared at him, waiting for the jest, the grin that would say he was teasing. But none came. "A world?" she echoed. He nodded once. "Where I come from, magic and technology exist together. We have great cities, towers of glass and steel, and magic schools, where children are taught to use their gifts. Where a woman can become a warrior, or a leader, or anything she wants." Lyanna pressed a hand to her mouth. Her chest felt tight, like her ribs were squeezing her heart. "And you left it?" she whispered. He looked up finally, his green eyes solemn in the firelight. "I didn't have a choice. I lost everything. My family, my godfather, my home. I was trying to hunt something important, and I ended up here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, throwing shifting shadows on the stone walls. "It sounds like a dream," she said hoarsely. "It wasn't always," he murmured. "There was darkness there, too." She drew in a shaky breath. "And your godfather? You said that word before. What does it mean?" Harry's mouth twitched. "A godfather is someone chosen to watch over you, to protect you if your parents can't." "Oh," she paused. "And you had one?" "Yes." His gaze turned distant. "His name was Sirius Black. He was everything to me after my parents were killed." Lyanna felt her heart ache at the quiet grief in his voice. "He was the one who taught me what family really meant," Harry continued softly. He disappeared in my world. I thought he died. But when I came here, I found proof that he'd been here before me." Her brows drew together. "Proof?" Harry hesitated, then reached for his pack. From it, he pulled a folded scrap of parchment, yellowed and stained with age. He opened it carefully and set it on the table. She leaned closer. Etched in a neat hand across the top were the words, "I solemnly swear I am up to no good." Below it were 3 names, Prongs, Padfoot, and Mooney. "My godfather was Padfoot," Harry said quietly. "And in your histories you call him Brandon the Builder." Lyanna stared at him, her mouth falling open. "No, that's not possible. Brandon Stark built Winterfell 8,000 years ago." He looked up at her, and she knew in that instant he was telling the truth. There was no jest in his eyes, only quiet certainty. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said, "but it's why I decided to protect you, the family he left behind." She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the child stir faintly within her. "I do believe you," she whispered. His gaze softened. "Why?" "Because you've never lied to me," she said simply. "And because none of this," she gestured around at the warm house, the stacked books, the flickering fire, "none of this feels like a lie." He looked down, his fingers brushing the edge of the parchment. I want you to understand, Lyanna. If you stay with me, you'll be part of something bigger than either of us. I don't know what this land will ask of me yet, or what I'll have to do. She rose and walked to him, her hand trembling as she rested it over his. I was never meant to be ordinary, she said softly. Neither were you. He looked up, and their eyes met. Two strangers from different worlds, and yet no longer strangers at all. A long moment passed. Then she drew in a steadying breath and forced a wobbly smile. Well, she murmured, since you're learning our letters, I suppose I should also learn to read your letters properly. His mouth quirked. You don't have to, because I have only few books and they are magical books and they won't be any useful to you. Of course, she said, her voice catching on a laugh. Harry reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For believing me. And though the snow still fell and the wind still howled beyond their walls, Lyanna felt something settle in her heart. Something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like hope. Chapter 20 The Dragon's Lair. Snow fell in a steady hush across the clearing, blanketing the rooftops of Potter Castle in clean white drifts. From the high wooden palisade Harry had built, the wilderness stretched in all directions. Endless trees, distant mountains, and the glimmer of the frozen Antler River. Inside the main hall, Harry crouched beside the hearth, unrolling a large piece of parchment covered in lines and sketched runes. Lyanna watched him from the table, where she was carefully copying Valyrian words onto a scrap of hide. You've been studying that for 2 days, she said, lifting her gaze. What are you planning now? He tapped the parchment with his charcoal stick. A home for Winter. She blinked. Winter already has a home. He sleeps by the woods. He deserves better than that, Harry said firmly. He's too exposed. Sooner or later, someone will see him, and he deserves a place as safe as ours. Lyanna folded her arms. You mean to build him a house? Not a house. A proper lair. She couldn't help it. She laughed. A lair. You sound like some villain from a bard's tale. He glanced up, the corner of his mouth quirking. If it keeps him safe, I don't mind sounding like a villain. For the next several days, Harry scouted the land around Potter Castle, sometimes taking Winter aloft to look for any natural caves that might suit. But every crag he found was either too shallow, too exposed, or too narrow to hold a creature the size of a small ship. At last, he came back one afternoon with snow on his shoulders and determination burning in his eyes. I'll make one, he announced. Lyanna straightened from the drying rack where she was hanging fresh fish. Make a cave. Yes. He began pulling on his thick traveling cloak. I'll hollow the earth myself. If there isn't a place fit for him, I'll create one. She watched him strap on his sword, though she doubted he'd need it to battle bedrock, and felt something warm flicker in her chest. You never do anything by halves, she said quietly. He paused, turning back to look at her. Neither do you. The site he chose lay 1/2 mile from the castle, a low rise of granite that jutted up from the snow like the spine of some ancient beast. Winter liked it immediately. He circled overhead in slow, curious loops, his pale wings blending almost perfectly with the sky. Go on, Harry called up. Have a look. Winter gave a soft, rumbling trill before settling atop the rise, tail coiling down the slope. Harry planted his feet at the base of the granite outcrop and closed his eyes. He could feel the weight of the rock pressing down into the frozen soil, the solidity of it. He drew in a slow breath, raising both hands. Excavo. The air rippled around him. Snow fountained upward in slow motion, like water disturbed by a stone. Lyanna, standing safely back, shielded her face with her cloak as the wind stirred her hair. Stone cracked and shivered. A deep, hollow groan filled the air as the front face of the rise sank inward. Harry opened his eyes. A black opening yawned before him, tall enough for Winter to enter, wide enough for him to spread his wings. Lyanna's jaw dropped. That's enormous. It has to be. Harry stepped inside, his voice echoing. But this is only the start. For 3 days he worked. He hauled boulders by magic, stacking them along the walls to strengthen the cave's frame. He smoothed the floors, carving a gentle slope down to a wide resting chamber. Inside, he conjured layers of insulation, thick mats of woven reeds covered with enchanted furs that radiated gentle heat. High in the vaulted ceiling, he left narrow vents for fresh air. Lyanna came each morning to watch. At first, she stood uncertainly near the entrance, But by the second day she perched on a nearby boulder with a basket of smoked fish, passing him bites as he worked. "I can't imagine any creature having a finer den," she told him as he etched a final rune above the entry arch. "It's more than a den," he said, stepping back to survey his work. "It's a fortress." Winter tested it himself by squeezing through the archway, his wings folding close to his sides. Inside, he turned in a slow circle before lowering himself with a contented sigh, his tail curling around his body. Lyanna watched with a smile. "I think he approves." Harry reached up to rest a hand against Winter's massive shoulder. "He deserves it." Later that evening, when the sun had dipped low behind the pines, Harry set the final protections in place. He pressed his palm to the outer wall of the cave and whispered, "Occulto." The rock shimmered like a pond disturbed by wind. A heartbeat later, the entrance vanished. Where there had been a dark opening, there was now only unbroken stone. Lyanna gasped, "You've hidden it?" "I've hidden it from everyone who doesn't know it's there," Harry explained. "Anyone else will see only a cliff face. And us," he smiled faintly, "will always be able to find him." He walked the perimeter, checking the other wards. Heat spells woven into the stone, illusions to hide tracks in the snow, charms to dampen winter's scent. When he was finished, he stood back and nodded in quiet satisfaction. Lyanna slipped her hand into his. "He's safe now," she said softly. He squeezed her fingers. "So are we." That night, as the fire crackled in the main hall of Potter Castle, Lyanna watched Harry set aside his tools with a weariness she understood. "You built a house," she murmured. "A granary, a wall, and a dragon's lair. Is there anything you can't build?" He glanced up, green eyes bright despite his exhaustion. "I'm still trying to build something else," he said. "What's that?" He hesitated, then reached for her hand again. "A future." Her throat closed and she swallowed hard. "Then I suppose," she whispered, "you'd better keep building." And in the deep quiet of the northern wilds, a man from another world and the daughter of Winterfell sat together, their shadows dancing on the walls of a place they had built with their own hands. The days grew colder, the wind more cruel. Even for Lyanna, who had spent all her life in the north, this winter felt deeper, heavier, as though the land itself were trying to swallow the sky. By then, Potter Castle stood proudly by the frozen Antler River, no longer hidden by Harry's magic. The first time the wards had faded, Lyanna had stepped out onto the front steps and drawn in a sharp breath. It was strange, after all the months of secrecy, to see their home so plainly visible. The walls of stone and wood, the wide yard where the sheep drifted like woolly clouds, the rising smoke from the chimney. But even stranger was the feeling in her heart, a hopeful ache she didn't know she'd been carrying. Maybe, she thought, someone will come. Lyanna began spending her afternoons in the watchtower Harry had built on the southern corner of the wall. From there she could see the broad white sweep of the river, and beyond it the dark line of forest. Some days she thought she could almost glimpse the faraway shape of Winter resting atop his hidden cave, his massive form blending so perfectly with the snow that she had to look twice to be sure. And then, finally, one morning she saw them, a hunting party. 18 wildlings trudging across the river in single file, their spears held high. A handful pulled a sled loaded with what looked like a freshly killed elk. They were bundled so heavily in furs that she could barely see their faces, but when they looked up and spotted the castle, she knew the moment recognition struck them. They slowed. They pointed. Lyanna's heart leapt. She rushed to the battlement and lifted her hand in a bright wave. "Hello!" she called. Her voice rang out across the frozen river. "Hello there." For a long moment, none of them moved. She saw them look at one another, saw their expressions darken. "They think it's a sorcerer's keep," she realized. Or worse. Slowly, they began to move again, circling wide around the Antler River. Some of them glanced back over their shoulders, wary, but none came closer. Lyanna lowered her arm, feeling her chest tighten. "They're afraid," she murmured. "Afraid of us." That night, as she sat by the fire, Harry listened as she told him what she had seen. "I don't blame them," he said gently. "They've spent their lives mistrusting anything that looks like power." "I miss people," Lyanna confessed, her voice so small he almost didn't hear it. "I miss hearing voices other than our own." Harry set aside the book he was reading and looked at her across the hearth. "I know," he said. "That's why I took down the wards." She blinked at him. "Truly?" He nodded. "I think it's time they see that we're not here to conquer them." Her heart gave a quiet thump of gratitude. It began at dusk with a low, sighing wind. By midnight it had grown to a screaming gale that rattled the shutters and piled snow high against the walls. Inside Potter Castle, the fire roared as Harry checked each room, ensuring the wards held against the cold. Lyanna sat near the hearth, wrapped in a thick cloak, her hands folded over her belly. Suddenly Harry stopped mid-stride, his head snapping up. "What is it?" she asked, startled by the sudden intensity in his eyes. He didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes instead, fingertips brushing the carved runes in the doorframe. For a moment he stood utterly still, as though listening to something only he could hear. Then he opened his eyes and met her gaze. "There's someone at the outer gate," he said quietly. "The gate?" She blinked. "You mean the main palisade?" he confirmed. "They're pounding on it." She swallowed, her heart suddenly racing. "How do you know?" "The wards," he said, voice low. "When they touch the wall, I feel it." He turned toward the door, already shrugging on his heavy cloak. "Harry?" She stood quickly, clutching his arm. "Be careful." His eyes softened. "I will." The snow was so thick it felt like walking through a wall of white. Harry crossed the yard to the massive outer gate, a great reinforced door made of black pine logs bound with iron bands. He rested his palm on the cold wood. The wards hummed faintly beneath his skin, a low, thrumming signal that people waited on the other side. With a quiet word, he dispelled just enough of the concealment to let his voice carry through. "Who comes?" he called. The wind nearly swallowed the answer. But then he heard it, thin and desperate. "We beg shelter. The storm." He turned back toward the castle, saw Lyanna's pale face watching from the nearest window. She nodded once, solemn and sure. He looked back at the gate. "Wait," he called. "I'm opening it." When the great wooden gate swung open on its groaning hinges, a blast of snow poured into the courtyard. 6 figures stood there first, men and women swathed in ragged furs. Behind them, more huddled in the swirling dark. At least a dozen in all, some clutching crude spears, others carrying bundles over their shoulders. 2 small boys clung to a woman's skirts. Harry stepped forward, his cloak whipping around him. "You're welcome here," he said. "But first, bread and salt." They stared at him, suspicion mingling with exhaustion. He raised his hands slowly. "You know the right. Bread and salt for guest right. No harm to you, no harm to us." Lyanna came up beside him, carrying a wooden trencher piled with dark bread and a small dish of salt. She offered it to the nearest man, a hard-eyed hunter with frost caked in his beard. He hesitated only a heartbeat. Then, slowly, he tore off a piece of the bread and dipped it in the salt. One by one, the others did the same. The rite was old as the North itself. With it, the tension broke like ice underfoot. Harry stepped aside, gesturing them inside the palisade. "Come," he said. "There's heat and shelter." They passed through the courtyard in wary single file, snow falling from their furs in sodden clumps. The last of them, a boy no older than 10, stumbled as he crossed the threshold. Lyanna caught his arm and guided him gently past the door. Once inside the main hall, they stood in a silent cluster, looking around in disbelief. The high beams, the crackling hearth, the woven rugs. It was more than any of them had ever known. "You built this?" the bearded man rasped, turning to Harry. "With my hands," Harry said simply. "And magic?" Lyanna added, her voice soft but proud. The man swallowed, glancing at his shivering companions. "Thank you. You can lay your things by the fire," Harry told them. "Rest. No one will turn you out tonight." They did, moving with slow, exhausted purpose. Lyanna went among them with bowls of steaming broth, and Harry laid extra cloaks over the children's shoulders. Hours later, as the storm still howled beyond the thick walls of Potter Castle, Lyanna watched them drift into uneasy sleep, bellies full, faces thawing. She met Harry's gaze across the hall. "I am very happy that I met you," she whispered. He shook his head. "So am I." And for the first time in many months, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they had begun to make a home that was more than snow and stone. It was a refuge, promise,